Good day. This is a recorded lecture for Chapter 17 that discusses water use and management, which is scheduled for week 13 of the course. Your opening case study in this chapter is a story about Lake Mead, which serves the community of Las Vegas. Now, most of you know if you go to a faucet at your home or office or just about anywhere, you turn on the tap and this clear, clean, safe water magically comes out. My question is, do you know where your local water comes from? We'll start with Lake Mead and the story there first. Between 2000 and 2010, the surface level of Lake Mead, which is the largest reservoir on the Colorado River and is behind the famous Hoover Dam, fell more than 100 feet. This occurred during the worst drought in recorded history for that area. If the water level happens to fall another 100 feet, that is, if the drought continues and that reservoir doesn't recharge from upstream, the reservoir will reach what is called a dead pool. This means it can either provide the water for the city of Las Vegas or the electric tower on which millions of people depend. In addition, projections are that Lake Mead could go dry in about 20 years because of the growth of Las Vegas itself, which means that the city is pulling more water out of the reservoir than it can replenish each year. So the local water authority, being concerned about this, has spent 20 years working on a contingency plan. And basically they have to look elsewhere for this water. And so they're buying up water rights and ranches in eastern Nevada and looking at other ways to get additional water for the city. Of course, the people in eastern Nevada, the ranchers there, don't like this idea, and so there has been lots of public hearings and lawsuits over this. This is just an example, a small local example, that for a long time planners and environmentalists have talked about, predicting that there are going to be water wars in the West. Closer to home, so if you look at the pictures on this slide, you can see Hoover Dam and Lake Mead on the right. And closer to home, you can look at your own water system, which I think most of you belong to, although those of you who don't, you may want to do your own exploration of where your water comes from. On the left of this slide, on the bottom, is the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, which is a smaller dam, but it basically backs up water up in the Sierras, upon which we draw that water and actually transport it down to the Bay Area in a piping system and store it in the Crystal Springs and San Andreas reservoirs that you can see here as on the top of the Hetch Hetchy picture. This is the top left, an aerial view of our reservoir system that we use. So your water basically comes from the Sierras. So like I said, when you open the tap, the water comes out, and water really is a marvelous substance. It's cool, flowing, colorful, trickling, and we are actually lucky to live on our planet, which is basically a water world. How many of you haven't gotten hot and thirsty and thought about how delicious a cool glass of water with ice in it tastes, or jumping into a cool pool or stream after being hot on a hike, or sitting around in the summertime? So water, in spite of its prevalence on our planet, is still a source of great conflict. And over 2 billion people of the population of 7 billion do not have reliable access to fresh water. So for the rest of this chapter, we're going to look at water and water use. This is the outline of the content in your chapter. It's also helpful to look at some units of water measurement. So in some cases we look at water volume, a cubic kilometer, and these are equivalent to 1 billion cubic meters, 1 trillion liters, or 264 billion gallons. A typical measurement of standing water is an acre foot. It's the amount of water required to cover an acre of ground 1 foot deep. And so you can see the equivalencies on this table here. And then we also have to have a measurement for flowing water, and we call that cubic foot per second, or CFS. And that's how many cubic feet flow by a measuring device per second. So that equals about 28.3 liters per second, or 449 gallons per minute. So we're going to come back to this idea, but as I mentioned at the beginning, that water supplies may indeed be the chief source of conflict both within our country and around the world in this century, the 21st century. So let's look at the hydrologic cycle again. We talked about the different cycles in some of the earlier chapters. So the water we actually use endlessly cycles through the environment. The total amount of water on our planet is actually immense. But the interesting thing is we rely on a tiny percentage of the total amount of water for all of our freshwater needs. And this will become apparent in the next few slides. We depend on water that evaporates from moist surfaces and falls as fresh water, as rain or snow, and then passes through living organisms and returns to the ocean for reprocessing. And this is called the hydrologic cycle. If you want to go back and refer to that, that's on figure, in chapter 3, figure 319. So you can see from the information on this slide that we get about 500,000 kilometers cubed out of the oceans every year. More than 90% of that moisture falls back into the ocean, so we've already cut that 90%. So the 10% makes it as fresh water onto the land. So that's what we initially depend on. And then we have to obtain that water either in streams or percolating through the ground or reprocessed through plants and so on. So this chart shows the average annual precipitation, and notice that the really wet areas are in the tropical forests, and the major deserts are typically found around 20 degrees to 40 degrees north and south. So you can see that precipitation is not distributed evenly over the globe. So what that means is that rain falls unevenly across the Earth's surface. And so some areas receive practically no precipitation, and other areas get heavy rain, more than they need on a daily basis. So when we look at global water deficits and surpluses, it has to do with the global atmospheric circulation that we kind of discussed in Chapter 15, and proximity to water resources for some types of communities, and also topography. So I'm going to kind of go through how this works. So the three principal factors that are listed on this side control whether you are in an area of water deficit or water surplus. So the global atmospheric circulation creates regions of persistent high air pressure and low rainfall, and that is about 20 to 40 degrees north and south of the equator. We talked about those descending dry air patterns in Chapter 15. These same circulation patterns produce frequent rainfall near the equator and between 40 and 60 degrees north and south latitude. So that gets you up in the temperate zones. Second, the proximity to water resources also influences precipitation. Where the prevailing winds come over the oceans, they bring moisture onto the land. So areas far from oceans in a windward direction, that is away from the windward direction, are usually relatively dry. A third factor in water distribution is topography. Mountains act as cloud formers and rain catchers. As the air sweeps up the windward side of the mountain, the air pressure decreases and the air cools. So the moisture condenses and it eventually reaches a saturation point, and then the moisture falls as either rain or snow. So on the windward side of a mountain range, much like our Pacific Northwest, it's usually wet much of the year. So the precipitation leaves the air mass going up the mountain, and as it passes over the mountaintop and goes to the other side, the air pressure rises and the air is drier. So this descending warming air rarely produces any rain or snow. And we talked about this. It's called the rain shadow effect. So the dry leeward side of the mountain ranges receive little precipitation. So this slide also summarizes what I just talked to you about. So the example in your book is Hawaii and how that rain shadow occurs in a very short area, and you can see it diagrammed here, where the prevailing moisture-laden air cools as it rises, and then it dumps most of its moisture on the windward side of the mountain, and then it comes off onto the leeward side and it's dry. And Hawaii is a great place to see these effects. If you go to Hawaii, which is a common place for many of us to vacation possibly because it's close by, you always have sort of a deserty part to those islands and a very wet part to those islands. This is another slide showing the rain shadow effect in our own area. The prevailing wind comes over the Pacific Ocean, and even our coast range wrings some moisture out of the clouds that go over the coast range. So we have a little mini rain shadow that occurs on the east side of San Mateo County. But then the wind direction further pushes our storms over to the Cascade Sierra Range, and because of the height of those mountains, much of the moisture is squeezed out, which is good for us in a way. And then we have the great rain shadow effects, the Nevada desert on the other side. So when I started this presentation, I talked about where does your water come from? Well, we get our water from the Sierras, taking advantage of this phenomenon. So there are various factors in global water deficits and surpluses. The atmospheric circulation that we've just talked about, and we talked about in Chapter 15, the persistent low rainfall areas, the deserts, and then the areas of frequent rainfall, the tropics. So this is repeating these three factors. And then, as we just mentioned, the proximity to water resources, and then the various topographical effects. So the point that I want you to get here is that we have very uneven distribution of water resources over the land areas that people live in around the world. Now we're going to get into the great technologies that we've employed to move water around to get it to where people live. But before we had these abilities, human populations were quite limited to places where there was sufficient water. The other factor in here is plants. Plants cycle water. In other words, they remove water from the soil and they evaporate it or transpire it into the atmosphere. About 90% of the water that plants actually move from soil through the plant system to the and goes back out to the atmosphere. So deforestation is a factor here because without the plants, rain enters the soil and then it doesn't get reprocessed into the atmosphere, so it leaves the local system. And in some areas, deforested parts of these countries, such as Greece, Lebanon, Africa, the Caribbean, and South Asia, are now more desert-like. So the other way to think of water is to look at major water compartments. So the distribution of water across the earth can be sort of modeled by interacting water compartments. And so water may reside or stay briefly in one compartment, or it may be held in another type of compartment for many years or even eons. So we can look at the length of time that water typically spends in these compartments, and we use the term residence time for that. So, for example, the average residence time of water in the ocean is about 3,000 years before the water evaporates and enters the hydrologic cycle. But as another example, water that is circulated through groundwater or into deep underground reservoirs or aquifers can reside in these compartments for tens or thousands of years. So this table sort of depicts Earth's water compartments. And you can look at the total amount, you can look at the oceans, you can look at what's held up in ice and snow, various groundwater sources, lakes, how much water resides in the soil, the atmosphere, rivers and streams, and also living organisms, and look at how water flow through the biosphere is sort of modeled in this way. So with that background, the important thing to note in terms of water use and management for civilization, really, and for biological organisms is a tiny amount of fresh water is actually available as the total amount in the oceans. And I think it's quite graphically depicted by these pie charts here. You can see the small slice of fresh water that is actually available or produced by the oceans. And then if you take that slice and you break it out, you can see a very tiny amount is actually fresh surface water. Now, until we were able to tap into deep groundwater reservoirs, our only source of fresh water was surface water, and that still is important for supporting many of our municipalities. If you then take the fresh water, that tiny slice of fresh water, and look at how much of it is available in various places. You see it's an even very small amount that potentially is available for use. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of this tiny amount of fresh water that actually is available to us is looking at these ocean currents. And the main point that I want to make here is that North America, which is where we live, and Europe, have the benefit of having warm ocean currents that go by. And also the Pacific, you can also see the circulation of cool versus warm ocean currents. So our fresh water is somewhat dependent on the fact that we have these warmer ocean currents next to our land masses that change the precipitation and the amount of precipitation we get. There's some concern that climate change will alter this and therefore affect that tiny slice of fresh water I just talked about, or the amount of ice melting and introducing fresh water into these ocean currents might change the way they function. And so we've got a concern possibly that North America, Europe, and the Pacific Northwest might be colder and might be drier under climate change. So we talked about of the 2% of all water that is fresh, and nearly 90% of it is tied up in glaciers, ice caps, and snowfields right now. Although most of this ice is located in Antarctica, Greenland, and the floating ice cap in the Arctic, alpine glaciers and snowfields supply water to billions of people. The winter snowpack on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains provides 75% of the flow of the Colorado River described in the opening case study about Lake Mead in Las Vegas in this chapter. You probably heard that this year in California is shaped up to be pretty dry. We started off with a lot of strong storms, but we ended up pretty dry. You've probably heard on the news about the water content in our Sierran snowpack is very low. So drought conditions have already reduced the snowfall and the potential runoff in the western United States. And climate change is projected to cause even further declines in this water supply. Now the reason why frozen water is important is because it acts like a reservoir, and because it's frozen, it gets released more slowly than if that water was provided by a rain event. When there are lots of rain events, then all that water goes into the stream systems and basically leaves the system. But if it's held by snow and ice and it's slowly released, then the water supply in a particular area is more even. Sometimes the term that they use is less flashy. That is, it doesn't flash up and down with big rain events. And so this idea of frozen water and the glaciers and the ice caps can be important to understanding the effects of climate change, but also dealing with our water supplies and use issues going forward. So chapter 15 talked about how climate change is shrinking many glaciers. And so here's an example of a series of photographs of Grinnell Glacier in Glacier National Park, going from the 1920s to 2005. So we have to think about the role of frozen water in terms of our overall water supplies. And then we have to look at groundwater. So after glaciers, the next largest reservoir of fresh water is held in the ground, and that's called groundwater. Precipitation that does not evaporate back into the air or run off over the surface and get into our streams percolates through the soil and into fractures and spaces of permeable rocks. Now this process is called infiltration. Upper soil layers that hold both air and water make up what's called the zone of aeration. Moisture for plant growth comes primarily from these layers. Depending on the rainfall amount, soil type, and the surface topography, the zone of aeration may be very shallow or quite deep. Lower soil layers, where all the spaces get filled with water, make up what's called the zone of saturation. The top of this zone is called the water table. The water table is not flat, but it sort of undulates according to the surface topography and the subsurface structure. So water tables also rise and fall seasonally depending on the precipitation patterns and the way the water infiltrates. So let's look at that on the next graph. So think of a rainfall event. So we get a rainstorm. Let's look at a mild rainstorm that we might get, which means the rainfall is not falling too fast. Kind of like what we're having right now in April of 2013, these light rain events. So most of that precipitation infiltrates into the soil. And so it moves down through the soil, as you can see in this diagram. And it gets basically as far as it can get. The soil is more upper soil layers in the zone of aeration typically have more air spaces, and so the water can kind of drain through that, and gravity is sort of pulling that water down. So it gets to a certain point, and this is determined by topography and amount of rainfall that you get over large regions and so on. You get down to a point where there's no place for the water to go, and that's the groundwater, or the zone of saturation. So the water table is the boundary between those two zones that you can see in this diagram. Now, in California, which is a good example, we have a drought season, 6 months of drought because of our Mediterranean climate. So that water table will kind of rise during the rainy season, and then as the summer comes on and it gets drier and drier, some of that groundwater either flows out of the system or does get pulled up into the zone of aeration a little bit. So that water table goes up and down depending on the season. There are some times in our very, very wet years where the zone of aeration, there's so much water that that zone of aeration basically fills up. And that's where you get these landslides that we sometimes get because the water's so, the soil is so saturated. Okay. Now, that zone of aeration is where most of the plants get their water supplies from. And so plants transpire, as we've talked about, and they pull that water up through the plant system and out to the atmosphere. So the amount of plant cover can affect the way that zone of aeration empties or is used. The other factor that you can kind of see in this diagram is the runoff. So let's look at a really heavy rainstorm where that zone of aeration fills up. Basically, the rain is coming down so fast that the infiltration rate can't keep up with it. So that additional rainfall, which is called overland flow, flows overland literally, and it'll go downhill slowly if it's being held up by plant material, but it eventually enters a low spot, a small creek, a small depression, which feeds into a stream system. So that is called runoff. And of course, when there's heavy rain, you'll see the streams fill up and sometimes flood because the amount of runoff is basically exceeding the capacity of the land to absorb it. The other factor here is that once the water gets down into the groundwater at the zone of saturation and below the zone of saturation, that water has a lot of residence time. It, sort of slowly moves downhill and may enter a stream, or it just kind of stays in the groundwater. And of course, depending on the type of geology you have, some of that groundwater may be held for a very long time. It's sort of trapped there. So the major, our creeks and drainages, and then our major streams and rivers sort of drain out this runoff that gets brought to us in these precipitation events. And you can see the size of the major rivers of the world. And of course, the only one that appears on here is the Mississippi River in the United States. This is another diagram I included just to kind of illustrate this concept. So rainfall that infiltrates into the soil basically flows downhill, and unlike the previous diagram that I showed you, you can see how it sort of follows a pattern towards downslope. Okay, and eventually the water table is reached, shown in the blue line here, and that sort of is roughly equivalent to the base flow of the local drainage that is near that slope. So what I want to illustrate here is those flow patterns, and if you have like a large slope here with a crest and a shoulder and a slide slope, the water table can be quite deep from the surface. The other thing that may happen, and we see this quite a bit in our Bay Area, is that sometimes depending on the shape of the side slope and the toe of the slope that you can see here, is that some of that water will hit the surface. That's where you get springs and like wet spots at the toes of these slopes, because it's just kind of flowing close to the surface of the land there. And then when you get into the bottomlands, very often the water tables are quite high related to the surface of the ground there. So again, that's just some more information about how water patterns work on land. So now that we've kind of introduced you to how this works, let's look at the groundwater system. So groundwater can have several features to it. Again, the water will infiltrate through the soil, but depending on what is happening with the geology, that some of that water may be what's called a confined aquifer. That is, the various rock layers are somewhat impermeable on either side of a more permeable rock layer, and so water tends to get trapped in those zones, and it may get funneled deep down into the soil through those various kinds of rock layers. This chart also shows how the water table will tend to fluctuate based on the shape of the topography, and you can also see the stream there, and how a spring results from a perched water table where water will infiltrate and there's a little bit of a impervious layer, and it'll kind of act as a basin and trap water of various kinds. Now when we're tapping into groundwater, we may tap into the zone of saturation that's sort of a ground well or a water well. If the water table gets lowered from too much drawdown, some of these wells end up being dry, as you can see on the chart here. And then if we're tapping into the deep groundwater that's confined by these different rock layers, that's called an artesian well, and sometimes those water wells are pressurized because the water is sort of compressed down in there, so the water is pressurized. So overall, our water use is increasing. Most of the surface water, if we don't deplete it, is renewable. So in theory, we could balance our surface water uses with the renewal process if we conserved and we also understood and how those surface water supplies are brought to us, and maybe we manage climate change a little bit. But we have to look at our withdrawal rates and our consumption rates. So groundwater mining is basically depleting water that is in these deep, long residence time aquifers of different kinds, whether they're shallow groundwater sources or deep groundwater artesian sources. So groundwater mining currently is depleting these water resources faster than their fill times, or faster than the residence times regenerate them. Agriculture is where the greatest water consumption comes from, and generally the wealthier the country, the more water use and the more water concerns there are in terms of this withdrawal versus replenish rate. So this is a map in your book that shows a projection by the United States government that 36 states will have water deficits by 2012. Oh, 2012 has passed us. So we're in this now. So the increased temperatures, the disturbed weather patterns, population growth, the urban sprawl, various wastes that go on are affecting these water supplies. And this may be one of the more serious consequences of climate change. You know, we keep introducing climate change into the discussions that we're having in these various chapters now. And I mentioned that one of my big chief concerns is about sea level rise and the disruption to human civilizations that might bring on. I think water shortages are the second big concern that we need to have. So think about how long you would like to be without water. And just think about that for a minute. So this chart shows the growth of water withdrawal and consumption by different sectors and the projected levels to 2025. And again, you can see agricultural uses take up the bulk of our water. You can also see that the withdrawal rates are quite high compared to the consumption rates. So agriculture is the greatest water consumer. So agriculture bears some discussion in your book. Spend some time with a treatment on this. So, you know, we tend to divide water into three major sectors: agricultural, domestic, and industrial. So agriculture takes the lion's share, and it's for crop irrigation that is responsible for 2/3 of the water withdrawal and 85% of the consumption. So there's some things that can be done to decrease the amount of waste in the agricultural sector. We have evaporation and seepage from unlined irrigation canals, for example. And the agricultural water use varies greatly, of course. So the United States is up there in terms of its water withdrawals for agriculture. One of the problems that we could solve, possibly, is that irrigation can be very inefficient. The main way we irrigate has been to flood irrigate fields or furrow irrigate. Both of those have evaporative surfaces that we can lose water from. Much of the rest, kind of runs off before it's used by the plants that are targeted by these irrigation systems. The other thing that we do is spray, and sprinklers have high evaporation rates. So there's growing pressure to figure out how to be more efficient here. So drip irrigation is one of the best ways to conserve water. So if we look at domestic and industrial water uses, which are smaller percentages, this is only 6% of the water withdrawals. So industry accounts for about 20% of this. And the main thing to think about here is that water, domestic water, once it's used by us, most of it is degraded and has to be treated, and the same thing for industry. So improving water treatment can also help here. This is the typical household use in the United States of where we put our water to. So look, I want to draw a couple of things to your attention here. Look at the large ones: leaks, faucets, showers, laundry, and toilets. So there can be room for improvement here, I think. This is a map showing the Agala High Plains regional aquifer, which is a major source of irrigation for some of these 8 western states that we've been talking about, water shortages that are possibly on the horizon. And you can look at the level to which this main aquifer is being depleted. The other thing that we have to think about, particularly in this state, is saltwater intrusion. So this is a diagram of how this occurs. Some of our fields suffer from saltwater intrusion because we remove the groundwater, and that creates sort of a vacuum. And so the salt water starts to seep upward and inland to these fields. So we've lost some fields from saltwater intrusion. Now, the only thing you can do about that is to flush it with more consumption of fresh water. So this is what we've kind of talked about, some of the different ways so that we withdraw water and we consume water. We're going to look into diversions and dams now. So, and as I mentioned earlier, dams and canals were sort of a foundation for civilizations because they can store water and they can distribute water for various types of communities. As a result, more than half of the world's 227 largest rivers have been dammed or diverted. Of the 50,000 large dams in the world, 90% were built in the 20th century. Half of them are in China, and China continues to build dams on its remaining rivers. Dams are justified in terms of flood control, water storage, and electricity production. However, the cost of relocating villages, lost fishing and farming, and water losses to evaporation are enormous. Economically speaking, at least 1/3 of the world's largest dams should have never been built, is what some economists have said. We tend to take our dams as just sort of part of our modern life, but when a lot of the dams were built, like when the Tennessee Valley Authority was created, a lot of communities were displaced, and some of the conflicts that we're talking about that are occurring in China did happen in this country as well. So although dams provide hydroelectric power and water to distant cities, they also have a number of unintended consequences. Reservoirs that are in hot, dry climates lose tremendous amounts of water to evaporation. Lake Powell on the Colorado River, for example, loses more than 1 billion cubic meters of water to evaporation and seepage every year. And as the water level drops, the salts build up, and that creates additional problems. Also on the downside, dams have submerged farmlands and towns. They've been shown to cause earthquakes. They block fish migration, and we've talked a lot about that. They change aquatic habitats for native species. And they reduce spring floods that drop sediment in to enrich the soils downstream. Sedimentation is a problem for dams because the sediment that is carried by the rivers, and some of that is natural from the flooding patterns of the rivers, gets stopped by the dams. So the sediment eventually fills up dams. So they have to dredge out these dams, and that causes an expense. And then, at some point, some of these dams become useless because the sediment builds up to the point where you can't operate some of the gates and the parts of the dam where the dams become dangerous in terms of the capacity that it's able to hold, particularly in a flood event. So this is a projection of reduction in runoff in dry regions by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is addressing some of the issues of water shortages that may occur because of climate change. The other issue that is of concern is conflict over these different river systems. As maybe the total output of these river systems reduces, there might be upstream, downstream conflict between these different communities, and particularly countries that share these major river systems. It might become a problem. Now, how many of you think that you pay too much for water? I actually think water is too cheap. In my house, I work to get my water bill down, although I could do better, and that's still something I want to work on. But my water bill is basically $30 a month, which in some ways is almost too inexpensive. You may conserve water out of the goodness of your heart, and that's really a good thing to do. But most of the water pricing policies that we have work against conservation in our country. One of the things that we've done, and the water rights picture can be quite complicated, but basically water rights have been granted historically in our country. So if you happen to own land and you happen to own the water right for that land, if you conserve the water and you send more water downstream, being a good person, you could lose your water right. So these price mechanisms need to be sort of reevaluated. Also, the various projects that built these dams sort of subsidized the cost of these projects. And what that meant is we're basically paying the operations cost, not the development cost of the water. So that means addresses some of the issues where our water costs are, in a way, are not expensive enough so that we are more likely to conserve. So what can you do? So again, this is another what can you do segment. So I think particularly in the West, particularly this year, we all should work on conserving water as much as possible. So don't flush every time you use the toilet. I know that might gross some people out, but there were times when the droughts were so severe that I remember in the 70s and the 80s where, you know, we couldn't do that. Take shorter showers. Don't wash your car or take your car to a wash place where they actually recycle the water. Don't let the faucet run while washing your hands, your dishes, your food, or brushing your teeth. Draw a basin of water for washing and another for rinsing dishes. Fill up your dishwasher when you have the opportunity to get the most water conserving and energy conserving dishwashing appliances. Dispose of your used motor oil, household hazardous waste, batteries, and so on responsibly. We've talked about that. This county has a great program for getting rid of all that stuff so it doesn't go down the storm sewer. Avoid using toxics as much as possible. You can use a mechanical device to unclog a drain and not use those acids or those lye Drano compounds that you can buy. Hot water and soap will clean brushes more safely than organic solvents. I had a plumber that gave me a really good tip. He said if you boil water for tea, which I do, about once a month or every 2 weeks, pour that hot water down your different drains in your house, and that will get rid of some of that oily buildup that happens and causes you to buy some kind of chemical to unclog a drain. If you have a lawn, use water sparingly. Water your grass or garden at night, not in the middle of the day. Plant low water use plants, low maintenance ground covers, rock gardens or other kind of xeriscapes, water conserving appliances, low flow shower heads. You can get, if you're replacing a toilet, there are rebate programs for low flush toilets that you can get. Try to recycle water in any way you can. One of the things I do, you know how you turn on your tub and you have to fill up about a gallon of water to get the water hot? I put my water, watering can for my plants in there, and then I just water my plants with that water. Repair leaks whenever you can. So all those things really help. So I began this chapter talking about where your water came from. So let's talk about our local water system. Even though we're on the peninsula, we get our water through the San Francisco water system. It's called the San Francisco's Public Utilities Commission, and it's the San Francisco Water Department. And so this is a map of the system. Right now, the city of San Francisco is going through an upgrade of this system. So the main source of water is the O'Shaughnessy Dam, which is the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. We basically pipe that water all the way to the Bay Area. And we have some storage reservoirs on the East Bay, and our main storage reservoir is the Crystal Springs Reservoir and the San Andreas Reservoir. So that's basically where the water comes from. And so on the shot, again, I have the map. I also have another aerial shot of the Crystal Springs Reservoir, so you can see what that looks like. And this is the Pulgas Water Temple, which is on Cañada Road. There's a sort of an exhibit that you can go by and visit about our water system. So this is a diagram that I think is in the question and answer part of your book, or it might have been in the previous edition, but I included it. This talks about how, you know, again, using this wedge idea in a way, is if we invest in water supply and sanitation services and we look at efficiency reforms and various other things, how we, you know, can maybe get our water supply to some kind of position of sustainability. So in conclusion, I hope I've presented the idea that water is a precious resource. So as human populations grow and climate change affects rainfall patterns, our water, this precious resource of ours, may become scarce or at least more expensive in the future. Your book talked a lot about the various kinds of water-stressed communities. I focus mostly on our own state and our own country. The point is that there are many ways to make water more available, and we can practice conservation and water recycling. And even though you don't have water shortages where you live now, it may be prudent for us all to become more water-wise in the future. The other thing that we've talked about also is the importance of biodiversity and the other organisms that we share the planet with. And it's not just about providing water for our own uses. One of the conflicts we have in many of our hydroelectric projects and our dam projects is the fact that we remove water downstream from organisms. So we have to think about that too. So the next chapter that we're going to discuss is chapter 18, and that looks at water pollution.